Perfection. It's impossible to achieve in sports. Even if you're not playing a sport that's engineered to at least allow the opponent to possess the ball, they'll get it at some point. They may even score. Hell, even in the most dominant win in Australian sports, the Corio Exorcism, the loser still scored 12 times. The closest a team can come to being truly perfect is by going undefeated, and that too is pretty rare. Of course, there's the Arsenal Invincibles in England and Touchdown Tom's American Run. But in Australia, we have salary caps that those Americans would call goddamn communist. They give most sports a more even playing field, so this sort of dominance is like Chas Mostert's hair, preposterous and something no one else could pull off. A couple of teams did it in non-professional eras with less games played, notably Collingwood. They went 18-0 in 1929, but lost a final. The Sydney Swifts did it recently, but played very few matches in a dying league. Some teams in a weird sport called NRL? Well, they had good sample sizes from the 30s to the 50s, but all of them had draws at some point. This team that shares their name with a bank was the only side to go undefeated through 20 games of a season in top-level Australian sports. No one would ever match that. No one would come close. Until these guys. Including the pre-season matches, this team had won 25 games in a row. Discard those, and they were 20 from 20. This team would revolutionise the sport, change the way the game was played. They were the 2000 Essendon Bombers. 2000 as in 20, 0 and 0. The Bombers had made it their business in the 90s to win. Only the Eagles and the Kangaroos, both veterans of 3 90s grand finals, had bigger altitude-induced nosebleeds than Essendon that decade. True, the Roos had won the 1999 flag, but only because Dean Wallace got snared by a smaller man like an antelope being taken down by a frog. On prior form, Essendon may have had the measure of the Roos, but either way, Fraser Brown robbed us of a repeat of one of the greatest full-forward battles of all time. For the two best teams of the 90s though, the 2000s would hit them like, well, that Fraser Brown tackle. Wayne Carey decided to destroy a team midway through establishing a dynasty from within by planting his captain's mast into his vice-captain's wife. As for West Coast, they just lost Mick Malthouse and were about to commit several crimes against football for which they've only now been fully punished. So Essendon, as 1999's minor premiers, were well placed to stake an early claim to be the team of the 2000s. And oh boy, did they. They begin by battering an average Port Adelaide outfit by 16 goals. They take top spot on the table, a position they will not relinquish until round 3, in 2001. Over the next 7 weeks, they have only one win by under 30 points. In round 9, Melbourne gave them a contest but never took the lead. Then they went up against an average Adelaide side who, typically, played their opposition into form. The competition had to wait another month until finally a team held a lead against the Bombers at an end of a quarter. Through 13 rounds, the Bombers had played 52 quarters of football. They lost 9. To put that in perspective, they had 2 separate streaks of 9 quarters that they won consecutively in that period. Of the 9 they lost, they did so by an average of only 9 points. They only got belted in a single 20-minute stanza once. A garbage time special from Carlton as the Dons just put their feet up and waited for class to end. Then Sydney happened. It was a wake-up call, only the second time the Red and Blacks lost 2 quarters in a match that year. But the Sydney siders had only served to anger the gods. Essendon had 13 scoring shots to the Swans 2 in the final term, with the Harbour City side lucky to only lose by 2 goals. Over the next month and a half, the Bombers would lose only 4 of a possible 24 quarters, all by 2 goals or less. They went on their biggest tear yet, 11 straight quarter wins. And, at this point, they were sitting on 20, 0 and 0. Forget computer failures, This was the Y2K everyone had feared. This was the true apocalypse of 2000. 2000. There were no jets falling from the heavens as prophesied. Instead, a fleet of 22 bombers took to the skies on an everlasting bombing raid. But the 2000 season had 22 rounds. The Bombers' work wasn't done yet. They'd been historically great, yes, but they still hadn't really changed the fabric of the game. And to do that, they'd have to make history, but not in the way they wanted to. Round 21, 2000. The Bombers meet Terry Wallace's Bulldogs under the dome at Colonial. The Dogs were just finishing up wasting their first golden generation, which had culminated in 2 preliminary final losses, both against Adelaide. They were okay now. Their only claim to fame was being one of the most accurate teams of all time. But Wallace had a plan. 2 weeks before, against a similarly informed Carlton, Wallace trialled playing an extra defender behind the ball, and it worked. Just. Wallace would require an upgrade to his system to defeat the winningest team in football history to that point, so he shifted one more player back, and then another, and another, and another, and another, and another, and another, until every play devolved into something that looked like this. 14 players were permanently stationed in the Bombers' attacking 50, with 4 hanging on around the outside to counter-attack when Essendon pushed too many men up. Now, flooding was nothing new. Sydney and the Kangaroos had used extra defenders to create space up forward in the 90s, but that was a shift of only 2 or 3 men, and it was an attacking tactic. The last time something like this had been trialled to a major extent to actually win a game of any substance was the 1909 VFL Grand Final. It was very likely that no living person at that ground had seen this level of football engineering before. And it worked. The game became a slugfest. Dustin Fletcher top scored as he suddenly found more open space to unleash his mammoth super boot. The Bulldogs had 51 rebounds and used quite a few of them to counterattack successfully, but the cracks were beginning to show for them in the third quarter. At the final break, the Dons actually had a 3-goal lead, but Wallace's crew limited them to 1 goal 2 in the fourth, scoring 5 goals for themselves and running away as 11-point winners. The Kings had fallen. The game had changed. Essendon had changed it, necessitated it, by being too good to defeat conventionally. Essendon bounced back with a win to finish 21-1. It was the closest anyone had come in the AFL era to achieving perfection by a long way. But it wasn't enough. They were bitter at the stain on their record, and that resentment directed itself at their first opponent in the finals. Now, North Melbourne were not a poor side by any stretch. They were the reigning champions, and Wayne Carey was still in his stride, instead of in his vice-captain's wife. But Essendon were at their peak, at the edge of the very limits that constrain football, and they were pissed at those limits. They wanted to break them. They couldn't. So they broke North Melbourne instead. 198 points. Again, so close to a mark that they wanted to break. Lloyd, Long, Hurd and Smokin' Joe Mazzetti wrecked shop, the big key forward even kicking his 100th for the season early on. Carlton, the other team Wallace masterminded his way past, offered no resistance as the Dons were 9 goals up at 3/4 time. The Bombers cruised through to meet a Melbourne side that had also pounded the Kangaroos into submission to earn a ticket to the big dance. The first quarter was a tense and exciting affair as the two sides struggled to gain ascendancy, going toe-to-toe in front of goal. And then, Melbourne just hit a wall. The Bombers had 14 scoring shots in the second quarter, their conversion rate saving the Demons from outright embarrassment, and the Windy Hill side continued their momentum right through the third. By the final change, Essendon again had a 9-goal buffer, and let's be honest, that gap could have been even bigger with straight kicking. James Hurd played like a man on illegal peptide supplements, Scott Lucas had a miserable day with 4 behinds, with Long and Blumfield not doing a hell of a lot better. But it was enough. 30 matches all told. 1 loss. No side has matched it. No one will beat it. The numbers are incredible. The 5th highest scoring side of all time, and 3rd if you include the final series. And, incredibly, the highest scoring side in the 20-minute quarter era. The 5th best percentage of all time, behind only 2 sides since 1994. 200 less points conceded than the next best team. Geelong matched the Dons' 21 win total in 2008, but lost 2 games. Round 9, a thrashing against Collingwood, and Hawthorn in the grand final. On most metrics, Essendon was far better. This was as good as the Bombers, or indeed any other team, would ever get, or indeed can ever get. They slumped the next season. They had to, they were at the apex of footballing achievement. But team greatness was about to give way to individual greatness, as their 2001 season gave birth to the best single player season of all time.